I don't think you should have done that, said Mr. Gruber reprovingly. It sounded as though you split your coat. Mr. Curry danced up and down with rage as he examined the remains of his jacket. I split it, he cried. I like that. And what was that bear doing at the time, I'd like to know? He wasn't anywhere near, said Mrs. Bird. I was looking for my missing page, Mr. Curry, explained Paddington. I think I must have used it by mistake when I was practicing one of my paper tearing tricks. Mr. Brown held up his hand for silence. Mr. Curry's face had changed from red to purple, and back to an even deeper shade of red again, and it looked very much as if it was high time to call a halt to the proceedings. I'm sure Mrs. Bird can mend it for you later on, he said. But now I think we ought to get down to the business in hand. Hear, hear, echoed a voice in the audience. Mr. Brown turned to Paddington. Do you know how long you've been with us now? He asked. I don't know, Mr. Brown, said Paddington, looking most surprised at the question. It feels like always. Nearly 3 years, replied Mr. Brown, which is quite a long time considering you only came to tea in the first place. Now, he continued when the laughter had died down, we have a surprise for you. The other day we had a telegram all the way from the Home for Retired Bears in Lima. It seems that Aunt Lucy is celebrating her 100th birthday very soon, and the warden thought it would be a nice idea if all her family could be there with her. Fancy being 100, exclaimed Jonathan. That's jolly old. Bears' years are different, said Mrs. Bird. They have 2 birthdays a year for a start, said Judy. Anyway, Paddington, said Mr. Brown, however many years it is, she's obviously very old and it's a big occasion, so we wondered if you would like to go. Speech, cried someone at the back of the room. Paddington thought for a moment. Will I have to travel in a lifeboat and live on marmalade like I did when I came? He asked. No, said Mr. Brown amid more laughter. I've been to see one of the big shipping companies, and they've promised to give you a cabin all to yourself this time at special bear rates, and a steward who knows all about these things to look after you. Paddington sat down on his chair and considered the matter. Everything had come as such a surprise, and his mind was in such a whirl he didn't know quite what to say apart from thanking everyone. I shouldn't say anything, said Mrs. Bird. I should have a piece of cake instead. I've made one specially. It's got Bon Voyage written on it, explained Judy. That means we all hope you have a good journey. Come on, said the man from the cut-price grocers as Paddington began cutting the cake. Let's have a chorus of For He's a Jolly Good Bear Cub. For the next few minutes, number 32 Windsor Gardens echoed and re-echoed to the sound of singing as Paddington handed round pieces of cake, and it was noticeable that even Mr. Curry sang, And so say all of us, as loudly as anyone. It'll seem quiet without you, Bear, he said gruffly, when he paused at the front door some time later and shook Paddington's paw. I don't know who'll do my odd jobs for me. Oh dear, sighed Mrs. Brown, as one by one the guests departed until only Mr. Gruber was left. Everything feels so flat now. I do hope we've done the right thing. No more marmalade stains on the walls, said Mr. Brown, trying to sound a cheerful note, but failing miserably as Paddington hurried upstairs, leaving the others to make their way back to the dining room. I shall leave them on, said Mrs. Bird decidedly. I'm not having them washed off for anyone. Well, I think you're doing the right thing, said Mr. Gruber wisely. After all, Paddington's Aunt Lucy did bring him up, and if it hadn't been for her sending him out into the world, we should never have met him. I know what you're thinking, Mary, said Mr. Brown, taking his wife's arm. But if Paddington does decide to stay in Peru, we can't really stand in his way. The Browns fell silent. When the telegram from Peru first arrived, it had seemed a splendid idea to let Paddington go back there for the celebrations. But now that things were finally settled, an air of gloom descended over everyone. In the few years he'd spent with them, Paddington had become so much a part of things, it was almost impossible to picture life without him. The thought of their perhaps never seeing him again caused their faces to grow longer and longer. Their silence was suddenly broken by a familiar patter of feet on the stairs and a bump as the dining room door was pushed open and Paddington entered carrying his leather suitcase. I've packed my things, he announced, but I've left my flannel out in case I want to wash before I go. Your things, repeated Mrs. Bird. But what about all the rest of the stuff in your room? You'll need a trunk for that, said Judy. Paddington looked most surprised. I'm only taking my important things, he explained. I thought I'd leave the rest here for safety. The Browns and Mr. Gruber exchanged glances. Paddington, said Mrs. Brown, come and sit down. You may not have made much of a speech at the party, but you couldn't have chosen anything nicer to say to us now. You'll never know what it means. I know one thing it does mean, said Mrs. Bird. I can wash those marmalade stains off the walls now with a clear conscience. After all, she added, we shall need plenty of room for fresh ones when Paddington gets back. That's most important. In the general agreement which followed Mrs. Bird's remark, Paddington's voice was the loudest of all. There was a contented expression on his face as he settled back in his armchair. Although he was most excited at the thought of seeing Aunt Lucy again, he was already looking forward to his return, and he felt sure that on a journey all the way to Peru and back, he would be able to collect some very unusual stains indeed.